Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to talk about utility allowances and utility reimbursements. My name is Melanie Mondello, and I work for the Technical Assistance Collaborative, otherwise known as TAC. And today I'm going to be your trainer to talk through differences between utility allowances and reimbursements, specifically focusing on the continuum of care program. So this is our agenda for today. First, I'm going to start by just framing what CoC program project types are and what the budget line items are for housing activities. So that way you have the scaffolding to understand where utility allowances fit in there. Then we're going to talk through utility allowances and reimbursements, all the details, the math of that process. And then we're going to wrap up with talking about policies and procedures and the documentation requirements related to the topics that we cover in the beginning of the training. So today, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and I will get to those during question breaks or at the end of the presentation if it's material I'll be covering. We'll also have a chance at the end and during the question breaks if you want to come off mute and ask your question that way. That would work too. So please don't be shy. You're here taking your time to do this training. If there's anything I can do to help you understand this topic better, please feel free to pause what I'm saying, ask a question, and make sure you get the information you need. Okay. So again, I didn't want to assume that everybody knew everything about the continuum of care program. I'm sure we have people of many different levels of experience with the continuum of care program. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is a very small subset of what the continuum of care program can do. And we'll really be focusing on the housing assistance options, and within housing assistance, how you can help people cover their allowable, reasonable utility costs. So within the CoC program, they have different budget line items, which you'll see referred to as BLIs. They also have different project types. So on this slide here, you see some of the budget line items. If you already have a program, these may look familiar. They should match up to your project application. If you're new to this topic or new to your job and just taking this role on, if you pull your project application, this is where you'll find the information about what type of project you are and what the rules are around your housing activities for your particular program. So HUD funds housing in 3 different ways. They have rental assistance budget line items, and under rental assistance, there's 3 different types. Tenant-based, which means the tenant and the landlord have a relationship. Sponsor-based, which is a 3-way lease typically between an agency, a tenant, and a landlord. And then project-based, which is a model where you have a landlord, you get a certain unit or access to a certain building, and the next person who's eligible for the subsidy that you have would live in that unit or that building, depending on how you design your program. There's also something called the leasing budget line item. And the leasing budget line item, they also fund housing, just one model. It's the agency rents from a landlord and then subleases to an eligible family, an eligible tenant for the program. Then there's the operating budget line item. The operating budget line item is typically used for building-based support. So it could be congregate living where many people share one house. It could be scattered site, congregate living where there's 2 units, one street, and then 2 units a couple blocks over or around town for the area that you served. When I'm talking about utility allowances today, they're really going to apply to the rental assistance budget line item and the leasing budget line item because they have very specific ways that utilities need to be calculated and applied. Operating budget line items can use these same principles, but within the regulation, they're not bound to these same principles. Operating budget line items, because they're typically, again, building-based, not unit-based, there aren't comparables always for comparing building A and comparing building B. So you would use a reasonableness test, right? For reasonable utilities that would be chargeable to your continuum of care program. So if you're sitting here and you're like, I don't know who I am, I don't know what type of project I am, that's okay. All of this still applies you can go back after and map your project type to the type of utility assistance that you will be providing for folks. So, when to apply the utility allowance and utility assistance. Basically, all of the models that use leasing or rental assistance, whether it's PSH, which is permanent supportive housing, RRH, which is considered permanent housing, but is also known as rapid rehousing, transitional housing, which is TH, and transitional housing can be leasing or rental assistance also. All of these models would require you to use a utility allowance and utility reimbursement model when a participant is responsible for some of the utilities related to the unit that they're living in. So we'll go into that more, but if you see any of your project types on the screen, this definitely applies to you. Again, if you have an operating budget line item, which is a possible option under the CoC program, you still have the ability to pay for the utilities. It's just in a different way, and you can use these as best practices and principles. So when we're talking about utilities, it's part of a larger picture, right? Utilities are just one cost of a unit. So I'd like to start with making sure everybody understands what HUD thinks the term unit rent means. So unit rent, when HUD sets a fair market rent, which is what your unit rent should be, it means to HUD the contract rent, which is your agreement with the landlord, that lease, plus a utility allowance for any utilities that the landlord has decided not to include and are going to be the tenant responsibilities. That's really important to keep clear in your mind because when you're going through your rental calculation process, you need to know these three terms and how they apply so that you can do the correct calculations. So again, contract rent is what's documents in your lease. It's the check that you send to the landlord. It's typically split between the participant and the agency. And utility allowance is what we're going to set for, say the landlord didn't include electricity costs. We're going to calculate an allowance for that. And that would make basically the landlord have less contract rent because the total unit rent cost has to be within fair market rent standards or rent reasonableness standards. So today, as you know by the title of the training, we are focusing on utility allowances and utility reimbursements. It's a very, like I said, a very small part of the whole rental calculation process. Rhode Island Housing hosted another training on October 28th that talked about the housing requirements within PSH. And as part of that training, about say half to 2/3 in, there are more details on the step-by-step of the rental calculation. You can learn more about fair market rent, rent reasonableness, calculating income, assets, deductions, all the things that I'm not going to talk about today, but is really important for you to know about. So there's a hyperlink here that will be in the handout that you received from Rosa after the training. It's also posted on the CoC website under the training sections. You can go ahead and link right to the YouTube video so you can get more of that information if you're not familiar with the larger process of rental calculation. Okay, let's dive into our topic of the day. So what is a utility allowance? I've told you you have to do them for certain project types, PSH, rapid rehousing, transitional housing. But what is it? What do you do with it? So utility allowance is a fixed monthly amount, and that is meant to help tenants pay for utilities that are not included in the contract rent that is being charged by the landlord. The allowances are determined by your local housing authorities, and the allowances are set at a amount that a reasonable person would use for utilities. I will say it doesn't always cover the entire utility bill. We all use utilities at different levels, but at its base, it's a fixed monthly amount, and that's really important. It's a fixed monthly amount that helps pay for utilities that aren't in the rent and are the responsibility of the person on the lease with the landlord. So a lot of people get confused when I'm doing monitoring visits. I see this a lot. what's a utility allowance versus the actual utilities? If you haven't done this before, they seem like they should be similar, right? Like, why aren't we just paying everybody's full utilities? But that's not the way that HUD has structured this. Utility allowances are a fixed monthly amount each month based on the type of utility, the size of the unit, and the type of building that it's in, whether it's a duplex, a high rise, a low rise, a single family home, if that happens for your program. Utility allowances also don't change as the tenant bills fluctuate. So if the utility allowance for electricity, which is a round number, is $100, you would give the person an allowance of $100 every month to pay the utilities. So over a 12-month period, they'd have $1,200 to pay for their electric bill. Their electric bills may rise and fall throughout the months. They may be higher in the summer if they have AC, or higher in the winter if they have electric heat, those types of things. But the utility allowance doesn't change because it's built right into how you're calculating who's going to pay which portions of rent. The other important thing about utility allowances is it's a fixed amount. It's already determined based on unit size, utility type, and building type. So the tenant should not be submitting utility bills to your agency to receive the allowance. And we'll go into that more at the end, but you should not be having people submit their utility bills and then paying the actuals on that utility bill. Because again, that's only going to reimburse you as the recipient or subrecipient who has a contract with HUD for the allowance, which is a fixed amount over the course of a month that can be applied every month that the person's eligible for the program. As you all know, probably from your own bills, actual utilities vary every month. They're never the same each month. For actual utilities, part of the role of your project staff is to assist tenants with understanding, okay, I'm giving you this allowance, but your actual usage may differ each month. So how are we going to do that budgeting? It's also important when you're talking about actuals and understanding that for your team and your procedures, that staff should be assisting tenants with budgeting if they need to keep their utility accounts current. So you want to make sure that people understand that depending on when they start in the program and how they use utilities. This should all cover most of it for the year, but it may not balance out on a month by month basis. So there's just something to keep in mind as you're training your staff about the allowances, which are a math calculation as part of your starting someone up on the program or doing annual recertification, versus the day-to-day, the month-to-month bills that people have to deal with. So I tried to break down calculating utilities into 3 steps. And I picked the 3 steps because most of the HUD guidance also follows this. So if HUD ever comes to audit you or monitor your program, this is what they'll be looking for. They'll be looking that you have a clear process on how you get to the final numbers that you're going to use to support your billing to HUD on a monthly basis. So when you're calculating utilities, first thing you have to do to calculate, to get down to a reimbursement, right? Because there's allowances, which is the fixed amount, and then there's going to be a reimbursement, which is what I give to the electric company or the client to pay their utilities. But to be able to even get there to calculate that utility reimbursement, first, I have to understand my program's policy for whether I charge rent if I'm a rental assistance program, or if I chose to put an occupancy charge in place if I'm a leasing program. So first thing I need to do is figure out, is anybody else paying a portion of this rent, or am I, as the project, paying the full portion? Step 2 is to calculate what the monthly utility consumption will be. So what is the reasonable amount based on the charts from your local housing authority by bedroom type, by utility, and by building type? What are the reasonable amounts that have been determined for the unit that you have rented on behalf of the client, or that the client has rented that you're helping pay for? Step 3 is taking the math from step 1 and step 2 to figure out who's paying what towards the rent, right? That contract rent. And then second, is there a utility reimbursement? And a utility reimbursement is the difference between what a person must pay as rent based on step 1, your policies about who pays a portion of the unit rent, and the actual allowance. So sometimes there is a utility reimbursement because the tenant portion that they need to pay per month is lower than an allowance. Sometimes there isn't anything to pay, so then the person might have zero income. So in that case, the person would get a utility reimbursement and they would be able to take that money that you give them to pay their utilities directly, or they can authorize you to give that money directly to the utility company that supports the unit that they're living in. So I hope you like math. If you don't, this is going to be your moment to embrace it. But as I go through the rest of the training, these are the 3 steps that I'm going to be going through. So you can use this later on, hopefully as a training tool for your staff, anybody that comes on new for doing rental assistance. So where does all this information come from? HUD published in 2017 a utility notice related to the CoC and the ESG programs. ESG is the Emergency Solution Grant. So in this notice, HUD clarified in writing what their expectations were about monthly utility costs and how they intersected with calculating that tenant rent contribution and the utilities that the owner isn't including in the unit. The utility notice defines what utilities are. Currently, they are gas, oil, electric, sewage, water, trash removal. They do not include telephone and they do not include cable. There's a link to the notice here. The notice is available online. And the reason the notice is important, especially as you're thinking about your policies later on in this presentation, is the CoC program interim rule doesn't have a lot of guidance around utilities, which is why HUD developed this utility notice for people to refer to as they're either launching a new program or reviewing their current program to make sure that they're in full compliance. So this is your regulatory guidance that you'll want to refer to and have handy within your management documents. So as I mentioned, rental calculation is a much larger process. We are going to be focusing today on step 4, which is determining the utility allowance. But you can see before and after, there's a lot of other things that you're doing as you're calculating the rent for the units that you're supporting for people that were experiencing homelessness and who have qualified for the CoC program. So we're going to jump into the middle 4, but again, if this is all new to you, you're just joining the training, Rhode Island Housing did already host a training about the full rental calculation steps, and that is available on their YouTube channel. So don't panic if you're like, oh, how do I do 1 through 3? There's a video that you can look at for that. So we're going to focus on number 4, determining the utility allowance. So as I promised, we're going to do step 1, 2, 3. So first, let's talk about calculating the program participants' rent, contribution, or occupancy charge. I'm going to go over this briefly because it's important to help you with the timing, understanding the timing of when you're going to look at utilities, and then how to apply those utilities for your specific project type. So this is a quick slide on step 1, which is tenant rent or occupancy charge. So just for review, the tenant rent, that's the term that's used when you have a rental assistance project. And rental assistance can be PSH or TH. We'll talk about RH in a second. The rental assistance budget line items, those are called tenant rent. That is where the person is paying a portion of their rent directly to the landlord for the unit that they're living in. If you have a leasing budget line item, there's a different term for the portion that the participant or the tenant would be paying. It's typically called an occupancy charge. And it's called an occupancy charge because that's what HUD put in the rule, but also to distinguish it, because remember with leasing projects, with leasing, I as the agency am renting from the landlord, and then I'm subleasing to a participant. So it's called an occupancy charge instead of tenant rent. You can use the terms that are comfortable for your agency, but these are the official terms that you'll see in the rule and in the guidance that HUD puts out. For rapid rehousing, all rapid rehousing projects, with very few exceptions, are rental assistance projects. So people ask, well, why isn't up above? Like, why wouldn't you include it in the right the top left box. That is because the way HUD wrote the rules, rapid rehousing projects, the way to calculate the rent for rapid rehousing projects is up to your local CoC. Your local CoC has set standards for how people that enter rapid rehousing projects, which are permanent housing projects that can help people with rent for up to 2 years and provide supportive services. Your local CoC has developed standards on how to calculate that rent. Those standards talk about how the rental assistance will be calculated, how many months people can receive assistance. Is it 12 months? Is it 24 months? How many times can people come and go from rapid rehousing projects? Is it once every 3 years? Is it once in a lifetime? Is it unlimited amount? So for rapid rehousing projects, you still have to do utility allowances. I just can't say this is the way you're always going to apply those utility allowances because you may have different models. Rapid rehousing projects may do it just like a rental assistance project. They may do adjusted income and give allowances and deductions. They may not do that. They may say a household will pay 10% of their income the first month and 20% the second month, and so on and so forth. So utility allowances do still apply to rapid rehousing projects. You're just going to have to breed the information that you're hearing today with whatever your local standards are to make sure that you're applying it correctly. The key with all of this, why you have to know what your rental assistance and your occupancy charge and your rapid rehousing policies are, is because all three of these set a maximum amount that people should be paying per month. And that maximum amount includes whatever they're paying towards the contract rent, plus whatever they have to pay out of pocket for utilities, based on the allowance that HUD thinks is a reasonable amount that your local housing authority set each year. So that's why it's important for you to understand this. You'll also see under rental assistance that you must charge tenant rent. So if you have a rental assistance budget, you have to have some type of a rent charge that is built into the model. It is not waivable. If you have a leasing budget line item, if that's how your project's structured, you may choose to put an occupancy charge in place. You don't have to charge people part of the contract rent or part of the utilities. That is something you may have designed within your budget. It may not be costs that you're sharing with the people that are eligible for the program. So it's just really important to know your model so that you'll know kind of how to calculate things when you're working with people and also how to tie all this to the billing and the budget management that you do for your project. So since our tenant rent and our occupancy charges impact, right, our utility allowances and possible utility reimbursements to people, it's important to know when you have to compute that tenant rent. When do you have to do it initially, annually, and any changes? So for PSH projects, you always have to do it when you're leasing up, and you always have to do it at the annual. So once a year, you have to go and look at the person's income. So at either of those times, if their income changed, then their portion of their income that they're paying towards utility allowances may have also changed. So it may impact that calculation. HUD also requires if someone's income increases or decreases, either because of a job change, household changes, all the things that can impact someone's income for the household that's being supported, then you have to do interim certifications also. So again, that might change the numbers for who's paying what for utility allowances and whether the client would be reimbursed for part of that or if it would just be deducted from their calculated portion of the rent. We'll go through some very specific examples about that, so don't panic. It is important though for recertifications, you don't have to redo everything every time. It's just the things that change. So if someone had a change in income, you would change that, and then it might change how you're billing the money out, but you don't have to update everything until that annual time point. Rapid rehousing, like I said, it really depends on your CoC policy and when they say you have to do initial, annual, and possible interim recertifications. Okay, so that is step one. I'm just going to open the chat and see if there's any questions so far. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep going, but if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, either now or at the end, we can totally do that. Okay, so calculating utilities. So we have calculating the rent, right, which is a whole big process. We can learn more about that in the other training, but we need to know what that amount is. And then next, we're going to say, okay, what are the rules around calculating a utility allowance? So first thing is, where do these utility allowances live? Who determines what the utility allowance amount is? Is it me? Is it the tenant? Is it the landlord? But no, the answer is your local public housing authorities. So the public housing authority that covers the area where the person is renting, that's whose utility allowance sheet you should use. You may also have a statewide utility allowance sheets by by building type that you can use. But the housing authorities, either at the statewide level or the local level, they have to do utility allowance schedules for all of the housing choice voucher programs that they run. They use the same allowances. So they have those utility allowance schedules and they can share those with you. So if you don't already talk to your public housing authority, please do, and make sure that that's a relationship that you keep up and that you have a way to contact them for this information as it changes every year. The utility allowances that you're using should be within 1 year of the current date. Some PHAs, I don't know if Rhode Island does this, but some PHAs do only update it every 2 years, but that's definitely the exception, not the rule. Typically, it's done every year. So you should build that into your annual process. Typically, it's done with the fair market rent. So it'll typically come out, it'll be effective for October 1st. So typically it'll come out like in September sometime. But again, it could be that your housing authority doesn't put it public on a website. It may be something you have to have a conversation with them about. So, but they do set the allowances, like I said, for all the utilities, the different building types, and the different unit sizes. So these are the utility types that HUD allows: gas, oil, electric, water, sewer, trash removal. The utility allowances that you give have to have the flexibility. You'll see this when you see a sheet. It may have options for electric heat, gas heat, oil heat, different ways to do the hot water. There are all these new technologies coming out for how to do this. So HUD will keep up with those as things go along. But basically, you have to be able to get the information from the landlord about how their building is structured and what that unit uses for electricity, gas, oil. Sometimes you'll see firewood, wood costs in some states, to look at that. And then by the different unit and housing types. That's something that people sometimes forget to look at. They just do utility allowance sheets and forget to look at the housing type up top, but that really does make a difference. So if you're a part of a QA team or if you're part of training people, make sure that you're using the right utility allowance sheet for the right unit type. And the unit type you'll be able to find on your housing quality inspection. They should all match. So the utility allowance sheet that I have in a chart should match the HQS building type, which then also matches if there's any description in the lease. So you don't want to have any mismatch there because the allowances are different for duplexes versus high rises versus low rises. They're similar, but they're different enough that you need to be very careful there. Again, utilities do not include telephone and cable. They don't include internet. Also, that's a question that we get quite a bit. So here's an example of what a utility allowance could be. And again, this is just based on those flat amounts. So in this particular scenario, we have a 1-bedroom duplex unit. The unit has electric heat, has electric lights, or electricity for lights, and electric hot water. So if I took a utility allowance sheet from last year for this type of unit, for this size unit, and when I add these all up, the total utility allowance, the amount that HUD feels is going to be enough to cover a reasonable utility consumption each month, is $310. So this person in this scenario would have a $310 allowance to cover the electric heat, electricity for lights, and the electric hot water. Everything else, if it's not listed, is included in the tenant rent that the landlord would be responsible for covering. So in this case, the landlord is covering the water, the sewer, if it's a separate charge, things like that. So that's the how to calculate the actual monthly utility allowance. Now we're going to get into taking that rent and taking that allowance and putting them together to be able to actually get down to the utility reimbursement. And the utility reimbursement is what also flows to your billing and your monthly drawdowns from HUD. So step 3, let's put it all together. So as you are determining the amount that the tenant versus the project is going to be paying for your unit, you're going to run into a bunch of jargon, right? We all start abbreviating things throughout our time in these federal programs. So your tenant portion could be referred to as a TTP, a total tenant payment. The project portion may be called the HAP or the subsidy payment, and HAP is just housing assistance payment. These are just terms you may run across, so I wanted to provide them for you here. So that's that first amount that you calculated in step 1. To put all the math together, you're going to need 4 different amounts, 4 different types of information. You're going to need that contract rent to your landlord, which we talked about a little bit. We're going to be covering the great teal box, utility allowances by type and company, if the landlord didn't include them all in the rent. You're going to need to know your total household income so you can calculate their portion about what they are going to pay if you're charging rent. Remember, rental assistance always charges rent. Leasing programs might charge rent. And then any adjustments to those amounts that are applicable to your project design. Rapid rehousing may have different adjustments. Permanent supportive housing may have different adjustments, things like that. So those are the types of information that you're going to need, and we are going to go over just this teal line. So here you can see this is an example of how a subsidy payment that would go out to the landlord would be impacted by the utility allowances that we calculated. So we have unit 1, which is a contract rent of $1,500. Utilities are not included in the rent at all. The tenant share, so this is probably a PSH program. It's 30% of the adjusted income. So it's calculated, all the math has been done about that, and it's $350. So each month under unit 1, this person is expected to pay $350 of their income towards the unit costs. The allowance that we calculated on the sheet that we got from our local housing authority based on our unit size, type, and building type came out to $310. So to make sure that the person does not pay more than 30% of their income, because that's what my project design is based on. What you do is you take the $350 that they're supposed to pay, you deduct the allowance so that people have that in their account to be able to pay the bills when they come in, because the utility bills are in their name, typically. So the tenant share of the rent would then be $40. So instead of paying $350 to the landlord each month, they're going to pay $40 to the landlord and $310 for those utility bills that are going to be coming in. So under unit 1, under that scenario, the rental assistance, the landlord still expects their $1,500. The client, the tenant, would pay $40, which means, if I did my math right, that you as the project, the recipient or subrecipient, would be then sending the balance, which is $1,460 each month. So that's for a unit that doesn't include the utilities. If I look to the right side and I look at unit 2, also $1,500 contract rent, but this one actually includes the utilities, so that's great. Less paperwork for everybody. The tenant share of the rent is the same, so their income didn't change based on whether utilities were included or aren't included. Their income is fixed amount each month, so it'd still be $350. Here, there is no allowance. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll fix this. here there is no allowance for the tenant paid utilities. So the tenant share of the rent, sorry, that should be $350. So it'd be the same amount that you calculated based on your program policy. The tenant share of the rent should be $350. So if I go down below, or I got my numbers correct, then the tenant would be paying the landlord $350 a month, and you, as your HAP payment, right, that housing assistance payment or subsidy payment, would be paying $1150. So this is just how you can see the difference on how it changes what you're going to put on your financial request each month to your finance team, which is sometimes called a rent roll or a unit list, kind of whatever jargon you use within your agency. So I mentioned that HUD had that utility notice that they put out in 2017. If you ever have to Google it, you can't find it. If you type in, you can see in the bottom left, CPD 17-11, that's the official name for it. You can pull it up online. Again, there's also a hyperlink in these slides that you'll be receiving. But within that document, they gave examples based on each of the project types and each of the scenarios on whether there is a reimbursement and there isn't a reimbursement. So I'm going to go through all of these now because I know we have different people with different models on the line today in the training. But you can also use this as a reference later to go back and say, okay, I looked at my application, I'm a rental assistant. Okay, I have my rental calculation sheet, I have no reimbursement. This can help you kind of double check your rental calculation sheets and your process as you go back to your teams and implement anything new that you learned here today. So in this example, we have a very low contract rent. Here we have $500. So these examples were a very long time ago. The tenant rent calculation, which you've heard me talk about, but here's the official reference for it also. It's in 24 CFR 578.77C. If you need the official language there. They calculated this. This is a rental assistance program, so they had to calculate a rent. It's $80. The monthly utility allowance, which they call a utility consumption here, is $30. So you can see, just like in my example, the 80 minus the 30, that's 50. So the program participant would have $50 they would write in a check to the landlord, and they would get $30 within their budget to pay the utilities as the bills came in. And then the recipient or subrecipient would then pay the balance of the contract rent, so that $450 to the landlord. So in this case, there's no extra checks for the agency, recipient or subrecipient, to pay because the tenant income was high enough that their portion of it covered the utility allowance or the utility consumption calculation. So this is an example of the landlord didn't include the utilities, but still within your monthly process, you still only have a rental payment to make. You don't have a utility or reimbursement to pay to a participant. This next one is, yes, there is a reimbursement. So this person had lower income, so a little bit higher unit rent, still not that much. The tenant rent in this case was only $30 by the time they took their gross income. They made adjustments for any disabilities, any children, any medical allowances that are allowed, all those deductions maybe drop their portion down. So they only have $30 that they need to pay for rent each month. The utility allowance or consumption that HUD set based on the charts that the housing authorities put out was $50. So in this case, $30 is less than $50. So there's a $20 deficit here. So that means that the participant would not pay anything to the landlord, right? They only have to pay $30 a month. They have $50 of utilities that they have to cover. And not only that, but at the end, you can see in step F, the participant needs to get $20 to be able to pay the utility bills that are coming in. And that payment of that $20 could be a check that's cut directly to the participant. And then your case management team and your services team could work with people for the budgeting to make sure that goes towards the utilities that are due. Or if the tenants would want to sign a release and give you permission to pay the utility company directly, then you could do that as well. One of the tricks there where you have a reimbursement, like in this case, is the $20. If someone has different utility companies, like let's say their unit has oil, heat, and electric lights, which is very common, then where do they want the $20 to go? Do you want it towards the electricity bill? Do you want it towards the oil bill? That's something that you would ask what the client's preferences, and then you could put that full $20 that you owe the person so that they're not overpaying a monthly amount of rent. You could decide with which utility company they want to put that towards, since it's a partial amount. You'll also see this scenario come up a lot when you're first serving people and they have zero income, because you're still working with them to get employment in place or job training or going back to school, whatever the person's goals are. A lot of people, when they first enter the program for rental assistance, may have a zero income. So you may have more utility reimbursements for your newer clients than the clients that have been on the program for a while and have gotten linked to either employment or benefits, financial benefits. Okay. To put it into different color, hopefully that separates it for people as you go back to look at these later. This is an example of for a leasing budget line item project. And HUD did this example out looking at someone who was going to charge the max occupancy charge if they could. So again, you see these terms occupancy charge instead of rent because I'm in a leasing program. Leasing programs may charge up to the max occupancy rate. You may charge less than the max, but this scenario, to keep it simple, is assuming that they're charging the maximum amount that they can. So under this example, we don't really worry about what the unit rent is, because remember, the agency and the landlord, they have a relationship, they're paying that directly. So the occupancy charge is between the tenant and the agency. So the occupancy charge calculation for this program was $100 based on whatever formula they used. There are some baseline requirements for that formula that are available in the regulation and in the other training that I talked about. So they calculated based on their policy and their procedures that are in writing that the tenant portion would be $100. Here we have a utility consumption allowance of $30. So again, we'll do our math. 100 minus 30 is 70. So the person's occupancy charge will be reduced down to 70. And the agency in this example does not have to give a utility reimbursement because the tenant portion that they need to pay based on the formula that governs this particular project was enough to be able to put money within their budget to be able to pay the utilities that they're responsible for. So that's really how you want to think it is, do they have the money in the budget based on the percentage that you think they need to pay each month to cover utilities and rent and not go over the cap, whether it's 20%, 30%, whatever the cap is that you set for your project. So this is with no reimbursement. This is an example of where it's a leasing project and there would be a reimbursement because the tenant portion is not enough to cover it. So in this case, the occupancy charge is $25, again, based on their policy for this particular project. The sheet that I did, the allowances with the unit type, the unit size, and the allowable utilities was $40. So when we do the math, the person would be paying over by $15 if we didn't give them a reimbursement. So they would pay nothing to the agency every month, right? That would become zero. And the reimbursement that they would get $15 from the agency each month to cover the utilities for the reimbursement based on the allowance. Now, in a leasing project, you may not be passing on the utility costs. You may be keeping those as the person that has the lease. But you have to remember, you could only pay up to the allowance. You can only get reimbursed as an agency up to the allowance that was given. You can't reimburse yourself for actuals. You have to follow the same rules that a tenant would follow. So if you're a leasing project and the utilities were not included in the contract rent, and you choose not to pass those utility costs and the utility bills on to the client directly and have the utility bills in their name, as a project, you can get reimbursed for the utility allowance, as we're talking about it here, but you cannot reimburse yourself for actuals. Okay. So that's yes. Here is an example of no occupancy charge. This is a leasing project. We'll just call it a permanent supportive housing project where they have chosen to not charge people rent. So they're not charging them part of the contract rent. But in this scenario, they have decided to push the utility bills that weren't included in the contract with the landlord down to the participant, the tenant level. So here again, even though you're not charging an occupancy charge, which is very typical for a leasing program and allowed, you still have to calculate what that might be so that you can calculate for utilities. So you only need to do this for the leasing units where there aren't utilities included, but you still have to figure out what the max charge that HUD would let you apply would be if you were going to charge rent. So in this example, they did the math and it was $35. Utility consumption / allowance is 20. Here again, there's no reimbursement needed because if we were going to charge them rent, we're not going over what HUD feels like they should be able to pay based on the caps for leasing programs. You're probably getting used to this model by now. So here we have leasing no occupancy, again, figuring out what the charge could have been, figuring out the allowance, which is line B, calculating, in this case, if the leasing program passed the utilities down to the participant and put them in their name, then they would have to give them $5 a month to pay towards those utilities because the maximum under the HUD rules they could have charged was $55 and the allowance came out to be $60. So HUD did not do examples for rapid rehousing because every CoC and even within CoC's programs have different models. But this is the logic that you can apply to the rapid rehousing if you have units where landlords are not including utilities, which is becoming more and more common. So, okay, so that was a lot of math. I apologize. Are there any questions on that before I go into actually great, you said I have to do this, but how? How do I do utility reimbursements? I don't see anything in the chat. Oh, you do, again, you can come off mute at the end or go ahead and pop any questions you have in the chat. So we have our allowances, we know our tenant portions, and now we know okay, what's the difference? Do I have to give someone money for utilities to make sure that they're not overpaying for the unit, or is it completely covered? So in the places where the tenant portion isn't enough to cover the utility allowance, then you have to do the reimbursements. Again, reimbursements can go to the participant directly, or they can go to utility companies if that's what the project participant, the tenant, chooses. So again, it really matters kind of which type of budget line item you have on how you're going to actually pay for those utility reimbursements. So utility reimbursement costs, if you're a rental assistance project, they are going to live in your rental assistance budget line item overall costs. You're not going to see that in your project application. There's no line in the project application for rental assistance projects that says utility allowances, utility reimbursements. It is assumed because HUD funds you at the fair market rent that you have enough money in your rental assistance budget line item to pay for utilities that are not included in the rent. So example is if the fair market rent for a 1-bedroom in your area is $1,000, but the landlord is not including all the utilities. Let's say whatever utilities they're not including comes to $300, then the most that landlord could get for the unit would be $700 because the rest of the money has to go towards utilities. Again, there's terms like fair market rent and rental assistance and rent reasonableness and all these things that you can learn about in that other training. But when you're looking at actually doing your financing, doing your billing, if you're a rental assistance project, any utility reimbursements that you give to participants or companies would come out of a rental assistance budget line item. If you're a leasing project, then you actually would pay utilities out of your operating budget line item. So if you have an old program, an old leasing program that already exists, I hope that you have an operating budget line item. If you're thinking forward to doing a new leasing project, then you should build in an operating budget line item for what you anticipate might be utility costs. So for leasing projects, you would have in your project a leasing budget line item and an operating budget line item. And the operating budget line item is where you would charge any utilities that the landlord is not including in the contract rent. If you don't have an operating budget line item, you can use matching funds or leveraged funds, which matching funds are funds that follow HUD rules exactly and meet the requirement of 25% of matching funds on everything but leasing. Leveraged funds are money that you put in to make the project whole, but don't necessarily follow HUD rules, but are used to make the project stronger and more accessible for people. So again, it's really important to know who you are. You cannot charge utility reimbursements to your leasing budget line item. The leasing budget line item is only for contract rent. And if you have enough money, you can pay for security deposits and you can pay for some staffing costs out of that. So it's important to know your model. So actually paying the utility reimbursement. This was a big change when the notice came out where HUD said you have to work with the participant to decide how they want to have their utility reimbursement given. So per the memo, per HUD, you have to work with your participant to ask them, do you want me to pay your utility company directly? And sign a release for me to do that. And when you do that, I'll also tell you how much I'm paying them. So you know if I'm going to give them $50 a month, but your bill's $60, that you need to make up the 10. Or do you want me to give you the money directly for the utility reimbursement? And then you will pay the utility bill directly. I've seen, even though this came out in 2017, there's still projects that are not giving people the choice. Their policy says that they will always be giving the money to utility company, and that's just not allowed under the notice that's currently published. So you have to have a process to have that conversation. You can talk with people about pros and cons of each. You can talk with them about, like if you have the money, like how are we going to make sure it gets there? You can obviously do that case management support, but you can't decide for them how that happens. Okay, any questions there before we get into some of the procedures that will help you implement some of these things? Let's see any. Okay, then let's just quickly go over some of the policies and procedures and the documentation that you want to have in your files related to the utility allowances. So what policies and procedures do you need at a local project level? So you should have in writing what your rent or occupancy calculation process is. That's important. It'll show that you're treating everybody the same. It shows that you have a clear way to make this happen. Each person that comes in, all staff will be doing it the same way. You need to have a policy or procedure, however you label these, about how you're going to pay the tenant utility allowance directly or the utility reimbursement directly, if that's the tenant's choice for their program, right, for their unit. And I say you have to have a policy and procedure for this because so many agencies still have policies that they can't pay a client. They don't have a way to write a check to a client, and it gets stuck in the finance system. So just make sure that if you are hearing this for the first time, that you work with your finance team to make sure if you put in a request, they will honor it, and make any modifications and share utility notice with your leadership team if you're running into challenges getting that put in place. If the person decided that you can pay the utility company directly, that way it makes sense. It's all paid. It's right there. then you need to have a way to make that happen also. It's a it's a better route for making sure the utilities get paid, but it's a little more paperwork on your side because you have to get a release for utility company. You have to have a process with utility company to make sure that the check you're sending gets to the right account. And you need the information from the tenant about which utility company covers which service. And then you have to get all of that by tenant and unit and utility company to your finance team each month to be able to pay. So you'd submit to them, like, send this much money to the landlord, and you would submit to them, please send this much money to this utility. All of the things on this page would have backup behind it, right? Like, I will have a signed release from the client. I will have my utility worksheet that backs up the information that I'm putting on my rent request and my utility request to my finance team. All of your tenant files should always be these things, whether we're talking about utility allowances or not. The up-to-date and including required documentation are key. A lot of places that only kind of update their tenant files if the monitoring's coming, or they do it once a quarter. It's very easy for things to get lost. And it's very easy, especially with the rental calculations, the utility allowances. If the file is out of date, sometimes those financials get out of date, and then you have to do a lot of adjustments. And it just raises questions about the controls that you have on your project. A lot of people, for whatever reason, in my years of doing this, sometimes replace things that have to do with financials. So they'll get rid of the old utility sheet to put in the new utility sheet. And please don't do that. The file content should stay. You can put a colored piece of paper between them to distinguish, right, the different calculations, but do not get rid of old calculations and old utility sheets because they support the billing that you did for those previous months. For your utilities specifically, you want to have the schedules that you use to determine the reasonable allowances. That is something I've seen people do it a couple different ways. So some people keep the utility allowance sheets at the grant level. So it's in your grant management file. They don't put it in each program participant file because they have it to refer to. That's allowed, but no one can ever get rid of, right, that master copy. It doesn't give you as much backup or control within the participant file to easily understand how you got to the utility allowance. You also, at that agency, recipient, subrecipient level, have to have your occupancy charge policy, because remember, that's not standard. HUD gives you a maximum, but you can charge the maximum or anything lower than that for your leasing project if you so choose. In your program participant files, you have to have the annual income, which was that step one. I recommend strongly that you have the utility schedule that you use to determine the utility allowance. So that way it's super clear, it's right in the chart. I can trace it back to your HQS. I can see it's the right date and time for the utility and rental calculation sheet. It's not required, but I highly recommend it. You're going to have the documentation of who's paying rent, occupancy charge, utility reimbursement, and all the math that goes along with that. It could be on paper. Some people are using softwares to do that now. However you keep that information, it just has to be accessible at time of either peer review, supervisor review, or funder review. And then again, if you're paying directly to the utility company, making sure you have the written permission, usually through a release of information, to pay the utility company directly. And this last bullet is where I would say 80% of people don't do it, right? Is documentation to the tenant of what the utility amount is you're paying. I've heard people say, well, I told them what it was. I told them I was going to give them I told them I was going to send $30. That's fine, but you need to also write it down, right? We don't want anyone to have to remember these things, and they need that information so that they can budget. You tell them I'm paying $30 a month. They get a bill that's $40 a month. They know they have to spend $10 that month. Or you're giving them $30 a month. The bill was only $20. They know they're going to have a credit going into next month. It helps them with their budgeting. So you have to have that documented to them in writing. You can do it maybe on a quarterly basis. You could do it on a monthly basis, just something showing that you gave them a document that has this so that they know by utility company how much you're going to be sending on their behalf if they have a reimbursement. If it wasn't possible to decrease their rent portion to cover any of the allowances that are given. This is a little more information than we're going to be going over today, but again, I just want you to see that this is part of a much bigger process. So when you're looking at your tenant files, you're going to have many more documents than the utility allowance under the rental calculation header. These are just some of the other things that you would see, and this is typically where I would see the utility allowances live, is kind of right behind that rental calc form with that utility allowance sheet in the file if possible, and then the letter to the tenant that says, hey, I'm going to pay $30 towards this to agency APC. The rest is just additional information that all plays into those calculations. Okay. Any questions from me? We've been a quiet group, but that's either because I've overwhelmed you or because you're like, I've got this. These are some resources that should still be available to you online. You can see the notice that I talked about. I linked to some of the trainings that were done about income and assets in case you wanted more information. HOTMA, if you haven't heard that term before, it's a reboot of how people's portions, what's included in deductions and assessments and medical allowances and all of that for that tenant portion for calculating rent. So these are just some resources that you have available to you. And that is what I have for you today. So any questions that people have? If you'd like to come off mute or put something in the chat. Otherwise, we are done for today. No questions. Thank you. Thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully you can use this tool, like I said, for onboarding anybody new that you have for rental assistance roles or leasing calculation roles in your agency. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so thank you so much for coming today, and best of luck with the rest of your week. Thank you.